Hey everyone, welcome back to Stadium Stats. This week we'll be looking at week 12 of the NFL schedule and then guessing the winners and losers of every game and then going into our top 10 list for the week. So without further ado, let's get into it. On Thursday Night Football, we've got a divisional matchup between the Steelers and the Browns. The Steelers, they're coming off a divisional win and a really hard-earned one against the Ravens in a game where they won 18-16 and didn't score any touchdowns and still were able to win the game. Their offense looked all right, but their special teams looked great as their kicker was nailing field goals the whole game, and their defense looked amazing as they were able to hold the Ravens to only 16 points despite them being one of the best offenses in the league. Browns, on the other hand, they're coming off a disappointing loss to the Saints, 14-35. Their defense looked terrible. Their offense really couldn't get much going, and it was just a disappointing day for them all around. The Steelers are a much better team than the Browns, and I really don't think this will be that close of a game, despite the fact that it is a divisional matchup. I do think that will make it a little closer, but I'm still going to go with the Steelers pretty easily. Moving on, we've got a matchup between the Vikings and the Bears. The Bears, they're coming off a really disappointing loss to the Packers in a game where they played a lot better than they've been playing in previous weeks. Their offense was working. Their defense was working pretty well. What was really disappointing was they ended up having a field goal blocked to win the game for the Packers. And the Bears haven't beaten the Packers in a very long time. The Vikings, on the other hand, they're coming off a win over the Titans in a game where they really didn't look that great. They won 23-13 against a bad team. Their offense worked well enough, and their defense held a bad team and a bad offense to only 13 points. Nothing too impressive there. I do think this will be a close game. It's a divisional matchup. All these NFC North divisional matchups seem to be really close. I am going to go with the Bears to win this one, as I think they will split, and I'm going to pick the Bears to win this one, as I think they're coming off a hotter Week 11 than the Vikings were. So I'm going to pick the Bears to win, but I really wouldn't be surprised with either outcome. Moving on, we've got a matchup between the Patriots and the Dolphins, another divisional matchup. The Dolphins, they're coming off a win over the Raiders in a game where they won 34-19. Their offense was really performing. Achane looked great, Hill looked great, Waddle looked great, Tua looked great, and their defense also looked pretty good. Although they did let up 19 points to a pretty bad offense. The Patriots, on the other hand, they're coming off a loss to the Rams in a game where they held their own. They were in the game through most of it, and were really able to just be in the game throughout. And Drake May looked pretty good, but he did end up throwing a game-losing interception towards the end of the game. I am going to pick the Dolphins to win this one. I do think they're a better team than the Patriots, and I think their offense will be too much for the Patriots' defense to handle, so that I think the Dolphins will win in a pretty close divisional matchup. Moving on, we've got a matchup between the Chiefs and the Panthers, and there's not much really needs to be said about this one. The Panthers, they're coming off a bye. They're one of the worst teams in the league, but they're coming off back-to-back wins. The Chiefs, on the other hand, they are coming off their first loss in a game where they lost 21-30 to the Bills. Their offense looked all right. No one really got going all too well, though, and their defense really looked not as good as it has most of the season, as they let up 30 points to the Bills, and the Bills seemed to be able to do whatever they wanted with the Chiefs' defense. I am going to obviously pick the Chiefs to win this one. I think this is going to be a pretty big blowout, but I actually think the Panthers will hold their own more than people are going to give them credit, but it's still not going to be close. Moving on, we've got a matchup between the Buccaneers and the Giants. The Buccaneers, they're coming off a bye, much needed, as they should be getting Mike Evans back for Week 12. They really need him. They've been missing receivers, and their offense has not been nearly as good without them. The Giants, on the other hand, they're also coming off a bye, and they also really need it because they are not a good team, and their fans could be spared from watching them play. They lost to the Panthers before their bye, and really they're just one of the bottom feeder teams in this league. The Buccaneers should easily win this one. I'm going Buccaneers to win. Moving on, we've got a matchup between the Lions and the Colts. The Lions, they're coming off a massive win over the Jaguars in a game where they won with a score of 52-6. It was the biggest loss the Jaguars have ever faced, and the second biggest also being to the Lions 30-something years ago. The Lions are a really good team. Their offense looks unstoppable. Jared Goff played unbelievable. Their defense held the Jags to 6 points, although that's not saying much because Mac Jones was in at quarterback. The Colts, on the other hand, they played a really good game. They narrowly beat the Jets 28-27. Their defense held up towards the end, and their offense played pretty well. Anthony Richardson had a really nice bounce-back game. Josh Downs played pretty good. All the receivers really played a nice role, and Jonathan Taylor didn't have a great day, but they made up for it in the passing game. The Lions are a much better team than the Colts, though, and I do think the Lions should get a pretty easy win here, but I do think the Colts will put up a fight. I just think the Lions are a far better team. Moving on, we've got a divisional matchup between the Broncos and the Raiders. The Raiders, they're coming off a loss to the Dolphins, 19-34, in a game where Brock Bowers looked fantastic, and the rest of the offense continues to look terrible, just as the case has been all season. Their defense also really looked poor as they let up 34 points to a Dolphins offense that had been struggling most of the season. The Broncos, on the other hand, they're coming off a huge win over the Atlanta Falcons, 38-6, where their offense looked fantastic, their defense looked fantastic, the Falcons couldn't do anything against them, and I think this is another pretty easy game. Yes, it is a divisional matchup. They tend to be played closer, but the Broncos are a much better team than the Raiders are, and I'm going to pick the Broncos to win this game. Moving on, we've got another divisional matchup, this one between the Cardinals and the Seahawks. The Cardinals, they're coming off a bye. They're 6-4. They're leading their division. Their offense has been working and improving throughout the season. Their defense has been improving throughout the season. The Seahawks, on the other hand, they're coming off a win over the 49ers, who they hadn't beaten in a few years at this point, 20-17. They were looking poor most of the game, and then Nick Bosa left the game for the 49ers, and they were able to come away with 2 touchdowns and come away with a victory, 20-17. The run game looked pretty decent. Their pass game looked really good most of the game, but their O-line did look suspect while Nick Bosa was in. I do think this should be a win for the Cardinals. I think it'll be a really close game. Every game in this division has been played really close, with the exception of one Cardinals-Rams game. But besides that, I do think this will be played pretty close, but I'm going to go with the Cardinals to win. Moving on, we've got a matchup between the 49ers and the Packers. The 49ers, they're coming off a devastating loss to the division rival Seahawks in a game where they lost 20-17. They had the lead most of the game and ended up throwing the lead yet again to a division rival right at the end. That's 3 times, 1 to each of their division rivals at this point, and they split the series with the Seahawks. Their offense really just didn't look spectacular. Juwan Jennings had a really good game, and McCaffrey looked all right. George Kittle was out. Deebo Samuel really didn't do all too much. And their defense was holding up most of the game, and then when Nick Bosa exited the game, they ended up playing pretty poorly and let up 2 touchdowns and lost the game. The Packers, on the other hand, they're coming off an incredible miracle win over the division rival Bears in a game where they won off a blocked field goal, 20-19. Their defense didn't look that great, as the Bears have been struggling in recent weeks and were able to do whatever they wanted against the Packers for parts of that game. Although the Packers defense did also step up in the moments where it mattered, and their special teams really stepped up when it mattered as they blocked that field goal. I do think the Packers are a better team than the 49ers, but I think the 49ers tend to play teams very close, and I wouldn't be surprised if this is a really tight game. I am actually going to pick the 49ers to get a bounce-back win. I do think they have more potential than the Packers, and with Jordan Love's recent turnover issues, I do think the 49ers may be able to capitalize, as well as the fact that McCaffrey has stated he needs to step up his performance, and the team seems to be disappointed with where they're at. But I do think this will be a really close matchup, but I'm going to go with the 49ers to win in a very tight game. Moving on to Sunday Night Football, we've got a matchup between the Eagles and the Rams. The Eagles, they're coming off a win over the division rival Commanders on Thursday Night Football, 26-18. Saquon looked fantastic, and had multiple rushing touchdowns. Jalen Hurts continues to play really well. Their pass game looked really good, and their defense was able to hold this really explosive Commanders offense to only 18 points. The Rams, on the other hand, they're coming off a win over the Patriots, who aren't that hyped up of an opponent, as they're not a very good team. But they were able to hold their own against the Rams, which is a little concerning for the Rams defense. But they came up when it mattered and picked off Drake May to win the game. I do think the Eagles will win this game, as I think the Eagles are a top team in the NFC, and the Rams are just in the hunt. I do think they're a decent team, but not as good as the Eagles, and the Eagles should win. Moving on to Monday Night Football, we've got a Harbaugh Bowl between the Ravens and the Chargers, as each of their coaches is one of the Harbaugh brothers. The Ravens, they're coming off a loss to the division rival Steelers, 16-18, in a game where their defense really stepped up. They held the Steelers to 0 touchdowns, but their offense didn't perform this time, as they only had 16 points on offense, the lowest, I believe, of their season, which has been a really, really good season for them on offense, but they seem to be able to be stopped by that Steelers defense. The Chargers, on the other hand, they're coming off a massive win over the Bengals on Sunday Night Football in a game where they nearly choked and pulled a Chargers moment and then ended up coming back and winning that game. They were up 27-6 and then let the Bengals tie it up 27-all, and then it was back and forth for a while with no scores, and then they came away with a game-winning touchdown right at the end. I do think this will be a pretty close game, as both of these teams are pretty good, but I do think the Ravens will end up winning the Harbaugh Bowl, and I do think that is because the Ravens' offense will be too much for the Chargers to handle. However, I really wouldn't be surprised if the Chargers' defense can hold the Ravens, as the Chargers' defense is a top unit in the league, and if that ends up being able to happen, then I do think the Chargers' offense will be too much for the Ravens' defense to handle, as the Ravens' defense is not very good. So if the Chargers can bottle up the Ravens' offense, I would not be surprised if they won, but I'm still going to pick the Ravens to win. Moving on, we've got another divisional matchup, this time between the Titans and the Texans. The Texans, they're coming off a major Texas win on Monday Night Football over the Dallas Cowboys in a game where they outplayed them in every facet of the game. The Cowboys scored one touchdown pretty early to make the game pretty close, and then it wasn't close ever again, as the Texans had control of the game from there. The Texans played really well on offense. They got Nico Collins back. He did have a huge touchdown called back due to a penalty, and then other than that, had a relatively quiet day, but their offense looked a lot better with him. Joe Mixon played amazing. C.J. Stroud played all right, and that defense played incredible. The Cowboys could not do anything against them, with the exception of that one really big touchdown. The Titans, on the other hand, they're coming off a loss to the Vikings in a game where they looked a lot better than a lot of fans would have thought. They were going up against one of the best defenses in the NFL in the Minnesota Vikings, and were able to hold their own. They scored on offense a little bit and kept it a close game. That being said, the Titans are not a very good team, and the Texans are a far better team. So I'm going to go with the Texans to win this one. And while it is a divisional matchup and they tend to be played close, I think the Texans will win this one pretty easily. And finally, we've got another divisional matchup, this time between the Cowboys and the Commanders. The Cowboys, they're coming off a loss to the Texans in a game where they had one big touchdown to Kevontae Turpin early in the game, and other than that, they played pretty poorly. They had some fumbling issues, they had some interception issues. Their offense really couldn't get much going besides CeeDee Lamb, and their run game looked terrible, and their defense looked terrible. The Commanders, on the other hand, they're coming off a loss to the Eagles in a game where they played all right for most of it, and then their defense let up right at the end and led up two Saquon Barkley touchdowns to lose the game. The Commanders are still a really good team. They're on a 2-game losing streak, though, and I do think that they're going to bounce back. They should beat the Cowboys pretty easily in this divisional matchup, and I'm going to pick the Commanders to win. Moving on to the top 10 power rankings. At number 10, I've got the Vikings. They've really been taking a downfall over the past couple weeks. They've lost some games, they've played some really close games, and their defense hasn't looked quite the same as what it had been. However, it's still one of the top units in the league, and their offense is still performing, so for that reason, they're in at number 10, as well as the fact that they've got a really good record. At 9, I've got the Texans. They've been playing really well. they've had some hiccups, especially recently. They lost 2 straight and should not have lost that game to the Lions or to the Jets, but they bounced back heavily against the Cowboys. Their offense is looking a lot better with Nico Collins back. Joe Mixon looks amazing, and their defense looks unbelievable. So for that reason, they're in at number 9. At 8, I've got the Commanders. The Commanders have been playing really well. They've been on a 2-game losing streak, but they've been to 2 really good opponents. Their defense did let up right at the end of the game, but it's been a lot better than anybody gave them credit for most of the season. And their offense has been really good, although Jaden Daniels has taken a bit of a step back over the past few weeks, especially since that rib injury. But they're still a really good team. They're winning games. They're in at number 8. At 7, I've got the Ravens. Their defense is a liability, but their offense is unbelievable. Their defense really should be a lot better, but it just isn't performing. Their offense, on the other hand, didn't perform this week, but outside of this week has been one of the best, if not the best, units in the entire league. Derrick Henry looks amazing. Lamar Jackson looks amazing, and they're carrying this team to wins. So for that reason, they're in at 7. At number 6, I've got the Chargers. They're winning games. They really should not have let that game get as close as they did against the Bengals, but they're winning games. Their defense has looked really good for most of the season, although that second half was a bit rough against the Bengals, but Joe Burrow is just really good, so that might have something to do with it. The Chargers offense also has been performing. Justin Herbert's looking good, J.K. Dobbins looking good, Ladd McConkey looking good, and they're just a well-rounded team. At 5, I've got the Eagles. They're really explosive. They've been improving week in and week out. Their defense has been getting a lot better. Zach Bond has really emerged as an unbelievable linebacker for them, and their defense has just improved week in and week out. Saquon Barkley is playing unbelievable. Jalen Hurts is playing pretty well, and they just seemingly cannot be stopped on offense, and their defense continues to improve. At 4, I've got the Steelers. They've been unbelievable in close matchups. They figure out ways to get wins, even if they're not scoring touchdowns, just like they did this past week. They keep getting wins against their divisional opponents, including the Ravens, and their defense is unbelievable, as they were able to hold that Ravens offense to just 16 points. Unbelievable effort from that Steelers defense, which everyone knows is good, but really, really good job by them this week. At 3, I've got the Chiefs. They're still a really good team, but they've had a couple fluky wins, and they finally got a loss. They're not as explosive as some of the other teams on this list, but they're getting wins. Their defense is unbelievable. One of the best units, if not the best unit in the entire league. And for that reason, they're in at number 3 because they keep getting wins. At 2, I've got the Bills. They took down the defending Super Bowl champions who hadn't lost since Christmas of last year in the Chiefs. They look like a formidable foe. They look like the best version of themselves. Their offense looks unbelievable. Josh Allen's playing unbelievable. They've got good receiver depth. They've got good run game. Their defense has really stepped up in the past few weeks. And at number 1, I've got the Lions. They look like the Bills, but even better. They're a little more explosive on offense. They just had a 52-6 win against the Jaguars. They played unbelievable. Their offense cannot be stopped. Their defense has really stepped up as well. And while it's not quite as good as some of the other units on this list, their offense is easily the best in the entire league. So for that reason, they're in at number 1. Thank you guys so much for tuning in and listening this week. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and follow me on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. And with that, I'm tuning out. See you guys next time. Peace.